Welcome back, everyone. Keith and I are going to talk today a little bit about a phenomenon that has grown in some circles as an area of attention for mental health, which we both have had a relationship with for a long time, which is this concept of nature deficiency disorder. And do you know who coined that phrase, Keith?
I don't know who coined that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember who originally came up with that, but if there was a person, but it's it's an important aspect of mental health is how what kind of relationship we have with nature or lack thereof, and what the impact is on our physiology, on our psychology, on our spirit, on our soul. So we're just going to explore that topic today and look into some different aspects of how we can address in a fast-paced 21st century post-COVID difficult time in the world. How can we access nature and stay connected?
Yeah, and it was actually, I just looked it up. It was Richard Love in Last Child in the Woods in 2005.
2005.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I also want to acknowledge that there is this element of privilege that you and I have, and a lot of people have, of having access to nature very easily. And then there are loads and loads and loads of people who live in big cities or urban environments or suburban areas where it's very difficult for some people to access nature, trees, grass, wilderness. So I think it's important to mention that right off the bat, that there's a wide range there of accessibility that people are experiencing on the planet right now.
Yeah, and that's a real phenomenon. I mean, there's no way around that. And it's good to name that at the beginning of the conversation. And I think storytelling would be a good way to start with this for both of us. I know a little bit about your childhood with nature, so I think it would be good to start off with a couple stories about nature and what it's meant to us, and we can go from there and unpack that a little bit. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Do you want me to start?
Why don't you kick us off? Yeah.
So my childhood, I didn't grow up in a family that cared much to be in nature ever. Like, that was not the MO of my family. Like, let's go camping, let's go find a natural spot, let's go to a lake. Like, that just wasn't a part of my family ethos. And I grew up in suburban New Jersey, where when I first moved there from Brooklyn at 5, it actually was very forested, and it still is forested. So I played a lot in the woods, but outside of like playing in the trees in the woods by my house, like, there wasn't a connection or a value around nature as a kid that I grew up with. And then when I left the house to go to college, and in my first few years of post-college, I had a natural kind of insight and discovery that I had nature deficit disorder. And now, I didn't frame it with those words, but I actually knew that part of my remembering who I was, like finding who I was to go and be a part of nature in a deep way. And this was kind of a natural discovery in myself. And it led to living in a tent in Vermont for 6 months out of the year. It led to just spending a lot of time hiking in the woods in Vermont and moving to Vermont. And really, it was like I was intentionally like practicing being with nature to see what was there and why, I was just being called to it for my early 20s, and in a pretty intense way. It was a very large part of my identity was I need to be in nature. This is my kind of spiritual path. I need to reconnect. I've been dislodged from nature, which is, nature deficit disorder, kind of the concept, right? That I was dislodged from nature at a young age and didn't have a connection to it. And what I discovered was I was actually terrified in nature. I was terrified in general, but I really felt that fear in nature, which we see a lot with kids in wilderness. I worked in wilderness programs, right, early in my career. We see this a lot where kids come and they're terrified. They feel their terror in nature because it's like the natural elements really, for me, allowed me to feel how anxious I was all the time. Because it's like you could project it on the tree and you could project it on the crack of the branch from the squirrel that ran over it. And then you start to realize like, wow, I'm a mess here. There's like nothing here that's really going to hurt me right now, but I'm very scared and projecting a lot into this environment. And my work in those environments were like, can I somehow receive from the natural world some kind of healing process from being around so much life force in nature? And I would say that overall, that was a nice aspect of my healing process. And I'm going to wind down here and turn it over to you. But, in my last 5 to 7 years, I've actually become disconnected from nature again. I go for hikes probably once a week, short hikes. And, we're in Colorado, so there's so much natural elements near us and around us, but I'm disconnected again. I don't make it a practice like I did in my early 20s to really try and stay connected. And I think I feel that, I know I feel that on some level. And this is we can talk more and unpack this, that like, how do we balance our lives and urbanization, and that not all people live in, but many people do, and modernization, and how we balance that out with the needs of nourishment from nature. So I'm going to pause there, turn it over to you.
Yeah, there's a lot there for us to explore. I'm curious if you're open to it. You talked about the changes you noticed in yourself when you were working with teenagers in the woods, and when you had more immersive experiences in nature. And I wonder if you could share a little deeper of what you actually noticed about your mind, and what changed for you when you were in those immersive experiences.
So when I was working in wilderness therapy, mostly, let me preface this, mostly where I worked for a year, a little over a year, I actually got to go in for a day and then leave at the end of the day.
Oh, okay.
I would drive a 4-wheeler out there. So I wasn't a trip guide. I was like, I was a therapist that would come in and work with the kids and leave. That experience for me was great. Like, I loved seeing what it did for these teenagers and the healing that it did for them. And that I could come in to the wilderness like that, ride in and be a part, like be in the world, and then go home to, again, a little more of a kind of, it wasn't urban setting, but a little more of an urbanized setting. For me, that was a great balance. But for the kids, what I saw was just powerful transformations. Not every single teen went through that, but powerful transformations. And mostly it was the wilderness that causes the transformation. It was the therapy was great, and the boundaries were a part of it, and the group process, but the wilderness was the medicine, right? That was the medicine. And I saw it, time and time again, healing deep injured kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's something energetic. You've spoken about life force, a few minutes ago. There's something powerful about the resonance of that energetic waveform of the life force of wilderness, Mother Nature. And this is just a kind of a subjective interpretation in my experience, but it feels like my uh, monkey mind, my default mode network, my chatter in my head, intellectual, mental, just random thinking has a much higher frequency somehow than that waveform of nature. And I noticed that because the presence of that energy is so overwhelming that it just, the longer I'm out in nature, the more it's like I come into some kind of vibration or some kind of compatibility or something. And it feels like a returning home in a way. The mind quiets down, and there's less distraction if I don't have a cell signal, or in cases where I choose to leave my phone and go for a walk without my phone, that kind of thing. It's just it's deeply resetting to the nervous system in that way. That's one of the big things I notice. I started. I would say my relationship with the wilderness started pretty young. When I was an infant, my parents moved to a log cabin that was in the back of a bigger home in the countryside in Tennessee. And I spent most of my time outdoors, wandering around, and my mom was there with me watching. These are the stories that she told me, barefooted and naked or wearing a diaper maybe or something like that. So there was this really strong connection from the very beginning there. Um, and then as I got older, camps and Boy Scouts, and I was in a Boy Scout troop that, uh, and there's a lot of problems with the Boy Scouts. We can poke them, and there's issues there. But for me as a little boy, my Boy Scout troop went camping once a month for 8 years of my life. And that's a lot of camping, you know, and it was year round. So we had this test of our strength in the winter when we would do our January camping trip. And it was freezing cold, and getting up and making meals on the stoves in the morning and playing capture the flag. And so those are all really positive memories for me, the campfire and just running through the woods and the South, all over state parks and national parks. And so that was a really big part of my experience as a child. And there was a way that I was uh, really looking forward to those weekends, planning the meals, making sure I had my gear, but I didn't have words for it at the time. But I think it was also like a really big refuge from the chaos and uh, terror that I often felt at home. It was just a lot going on at home. So nature, I think, also for me has always been like a way to go away from difficult interpersonal relationships. So there's a connection there for me with that.
When going back to what you said about the energy that you feel in nature, like for you, do you calm down when you go into nature? Like, do you feel your system just immediately starting to calm down if you're going for a walk or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes time. I mean, and there's a depth that I think I haven't ever fully plumbed as far as like, what would happen if I was out for twice as long or 5 times as long as what I've done before in the past? What if I was out there like you in a tent for 6 months in Vermont? Like I've never lived in a tent for 6 months. I've done it for a week or two at the most, but I wonder how deep that regulation and that resonance can go.
Well, it didn't necessarily get that deep for me, but just because for me, like settling is work. Many people it is, but it's very confronting for me to pause. And so for me, those 6 months, and that was also, bear in mind, the 6 months was 22, 24 years ago, and I was so severely traumatized that sitting in a tent alone in the woods was actually deeply, deeply confronting to how jarred my nervous system was. So it was healing and a lot of work, and still is. I go for a walk, by myself. I tend to do at least one a week, typically. And I notice, like, as soon as I'm alone walking, that usually the starting point is an amping up for me, where I feel a little heightened and like, and my mind's going everywhere. And like, I really see, like, all of a sudden I actually kick up from the level of monkey mind that I'm normally in for a little bit when I'm just like walking in the woods. And then it's like work for me. I'm feeling like it's just this process for me of like, can I take it in? Can I be present? And, some people just go in the woods. I've talked to people, they go in the woods and they're like, I'm just in a flow state. I go to the woods and I walk and immediately enter flow. I have that more like at work and other places, but when I'm pausing like that, actually it's work for me to enter flow. And it's good to do that. And but it's also I am disconnected from nature too, and I think that's a part of what's happening for me is feeling that disconnection.
Yeah, I think there was, for me, an early association with play in the forest. I had this friend, he's my best friend in elementary school, Harrison Dean. And Harrison lived in a house where there was a big forest on a hill behind him. And, from an adult perspective, looking back, I'm thinking, whose property was that? I don't even know if it was public or if we were trespassing or what. There were no fences. There was nothing. There was just forest. And Harrison and I found this fallen tree. It was, we called it the spaceship, and it was sort of like a fort. And we would, act out all these things that were happening. And then pretty soon after that, one of the Star Wars movies came out with the Ewoks in this forest with all these huge fallen trees. And I saw the movie after Harrison and I were kind of already doing this thing in the forest with the spaceship and the tree. And I was like, wow, we knew what was going on before it was even in the movie.
Were you an Ewok or were you like Han Solo? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I've always had this sweet association with like play and connection, and putting all the stress of life behind me for a minute. I'm also realizing that, when you're talking about like taking a sip of nature with a walk, once a week, that in a previous lifetime when I was a psychiatrist and I had a practice where I worked 3 days a week and, was able to cover my bills and run my life on a 3-day work week. I spent quite a bit more time in nature. There were fewer people looking for me or trying to get a hold of me. And since you and I started the clinic and we started the institute, you know, there's a lot more people who need to talk to me, especially now that we've grown so much. And so it feels like it's a little bit harder for me to turn things off and get away.
Yeah, I think this concept of nourishment is important. Like, nature is food, right, for our systems in a different way than food is.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't remove that we're just really in an animal body that lives in the natural world, and that's real, and that's what's happening. And I think that we don't often really critically look at that animals receive something from the natural world, not just what they eat. They do receive something from being in the natural world, and we see that with animals that get put in cages and zoos, and where you can see depression and all these different elements that happen. And so that, I think that's a real thing. And it's okay. So here we are, we've built this incredible world around us, in the last, whatever, couple thousand years, or really the last 1,000 years, where we really went crazy. And we built this thing, and it's cool and it's exciting. And for some people, it's more exciting than for others, depending on where you are and who you are. And yet we definitely, probably as a global community, not local communities, have started to forgotten that we do get nourishment from the natural world. And what does that mean if we forget that over time, and we keep forgetting that? And how well are we going to do? It's a really important question in terms of where do we go as individuals, and how important is it for an individual to have this connection? How do they get it if they can't access it out their door? And there's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, and in a world that, especially, in the pandemic and kind of the work from home environment that kind of persists after the pandemic, there's even less venturing out of where we live than there used to be, which is not to say that people were getting out into nature necessarily more, but there's more of a center of gravity around, where we dwell. And how are we, as the world becomes more digital and we have more and more of our interactions with other people over the internet, like you and I are right now, like how do we meet that need?
Yeah.
Is there going to be some kind of immersive virtual reality nature experience that triggers off the beneficial cascade of chemical signaling in the body?
Well, probably. I mean, over time. But I don't know what to make of that. But that's probably going to happen. If it already isn't, I mean, it's probably already happening. Yeah. I think that for me, one thing, when we talk about nature deficit disorder, and if we think about people who are struggling with mental health, I think it's just always important to ask the question of person struggling with their mental health, of like, how's that going for you? Now, some people will have that completely covered and they're still deeply struggling with their mental health, right? So it's not like, that's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
There are plenty of mentally ill people that go to the woods every day, or they love the woods and all of that. But I do think it's really important from a mental health perspective to always ask the question, like, what is your connection to the natural world and to nature, and how are you fulfilling that connection? And have you explored that connection? I mean, I think another element here is, you and I have explored this in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more disconnected now than I used to be, but I also live in Colorado and still get it, right? So,
Right.
but a lot of people haven't even asked the question, like, to themselves: is nature important? There's many people I met in my practice over the years, and especially when I've worked with people from cities who grew up in cities. There's many people that I met that never asked the question. Actually, they just said, "I don't like nature," is the response. I don't like the woods. I don't like to hike. I don't like nature. And I get why. I know why, because when I went to nature, and to some level still do, I get uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, I think that if we're talking about mental health, it's a very important thing to ask someone if they're struggling: is what's their connection to nature, and why haven't they explored it?
Mm-hmm.
Why haven't they explored it if they haven't explored it? And why did they make conclusions about it, right, that are so fixed if they've never even explored it?
Well, and there's also this interesting kind of like meta kind of cultural phenomenon around our cultural relationship with nature and wilderness, and a kind of, I would say, adversarial or fear and scarcity kind of driven relationship with nature. I remember in high school getting introduced to Nathaniel Hawthorne and some of the early American fiction writers, and we were looking at how early colonial Americans related to nature out beyond the fort or the perimeter of the town, and there was a tremendous amount of fear in the settlers, right? Because the forest was full of animals that could, might attack them. There were Native Americans who were not happy about the appropriation of lands and who might come in and raid them or attack them. And so there's this interesting kind of problematic relationship with nature, that I think is also not just personal, but it's also cultural. And I think there's also an extension of that, which is that, we kind of know that most of the places that we have urbanized or that we have appropriated, belong to someone else before we came in and took control of the land.
Yeah.
And so I feel that acutely when I'm walking through nature in Colorado or places I've been, that I'm not the lineage of people that I come from in Europe are not the earliest people who came there, and so I think it just brings up a lot, not necessarily just a personal experience of growing up disconnected from nature, but also like the messaging, the cultural messaging.
Well, where you're taking this, I think, is really important, which is, I think that the more you can stay connected to the natural environment and land, you start to actually feel the history, and you're willing to actually recognize the history of where you are. And, a lot of people, and I'm definitely subject to this at times too, like, don't want to look at the history of why we have certain opportunities on the land that we're on. And because the history is actually really violent and really dark on a lot of land in the world. There's a lot of dark history, right? And so when we stay connected, and willing to really deeply connect, when we talk about the land, there's that relationship. We have to relate to a lot of things about the environment around us, and it's not just I'm taking this in a little different place, but it's not only that we get to relate to like, oh, the sunshine is so warm, right? We also have to relate to the history that's not just about us,
Mhm.
and our immediacy, and there's a richness there of being able to do that, staying connected in that way. Um, but it's humbling to have to do that, because then we're willing to look at what happened to provide certain opportunities. Um, and of course, I'm speaking mostly about this country in the moment. Um, and this country has a violent history around the land, uh, in order to claim the land here and overtake people that were here. So I think that it's staying connected to nature. It's not. It opens up a very rich, deep dynamic of being a part of human history, and the good and the bad there, and the really ugly, in a good way to open that up for oneself. Um, and also, I think a lot of people don't, it's not on their radar to go there and do that, to stay connected to the land and maybe open this up, this piece. But also, you don't get the magic of the land if we don't relate to it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting, to me, it's sort of like an interesting metaphor, or the micro and the macro of, um, if I, when I think about a person's psychology, like there's certain things that we're aware of, certain things that we know. We have thought patterns. We have an ego, and we're conscious of some of our thoughts. But there's an awful lot of things that we're not conscious of, things that we're not aware of. And when I think about going into the wilderness, I think about kind of the metaphor of going into the part of myself, or the part of my mind that I don't know. If you think about your psychology as a landscape, I think about my ego a lot as a kind of a city on a hill that's well defended with big walls and cannons aimed outward and that kind of thing. And then there's a whole, like in a fairy tale, there's like the fire swamp and the dark forest and the places that I'm scared to go, you know? And and so I think that's also a dimension for me of how I relate to the wilderness, is going into places that I don't know what I'm going to encounter. And that definitely brings things up for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think back. You're making me think back again. Well, not making me, but I'm recalling the wilderness therapy year, where it was actually a year, and then I also did another section in wilderness, and just there was this view held. I was at a program in Idaho, and the view is that uh, people wilderness will inherently heal these teens as part of the thing. That was one view being held there. And another view was that what you're talking about, which is that the wilderness is just how we perceive the wilderness is just a manifestation of the wild wilderness in our own mind. And that was another view, that it's just a mirror of like how we relate to the wilderness, is a mirror to the wilderness in ourselves. Um, and that, by exploring the wilderness externally, we get to explore the wilderness internally. And that was a view. And I think that the evidence I have, just after these programs had a lot of kids in them, so I probably worked with a few hundred kids when I was there, not that many, but enough, who were deeply, deeply, deeply injured human beings, deep, deep trauma. In almost every kid that came in there was some kind of trauma, obviously, and complex mental illness of some sort, basically. I saw these teens start to naturally speak about the wilderness in themselves without
Hmm.
even having to push that agenda.
Well,
I saw them starting to surface and discover aspects of themselves they didn't knew existed. Um, so I think this is the magic and of the wilderness is that, nature, and particularly, I mean, there's nature, like we could go to a park, right? And like there's
yeah,
trees, and that's one thing. And that needs to happen. We need trees and parks and things around us. That's great. But when you're in the wilderness, like there's you're a little off grid, and like maybe you see a person here and there, but you feel like you're with nature predominantly. Something else happens there. Uh,
yeah.
and it's unique for every person what happens there, right?
Yeah, it's an important distinction you're saying. I mean, a city park or a manicured kind of human designed or human controlled natural environment's really, really different from backcountry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I think that where I'm going with that is I think people who live in cities, I mean, I think that visiting parks is very important, and it's uh, getting to be surrounded by more green and natural elements, and um, that's great. And then I think it for people who have not made it a practice and can somehow get to the wilderness of, and wilderness has a lot of forms. I mean, the desert is a wilderness, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's just a non-urbanized environment that still has natural elements is the wilderness in my mind. So I think that that is essential to explore that somehow, uh, and to visit the wilderness um, for some period of your life, or even to touch back in at times. And if you can create that access, I think it's an amazing uh, place to get to know oneself and to heal parts of ourselves that, honestly, maybe the recipe is to be in wilderness for certain parts of ourselves.
right.
Maybe many people, I would say, probably from what I saw, many people have parts of ourselves that the way they will get healed is to be in wilderness. Not the whole self, but there are aspects that need the wilderness. And that's the nature deficit disorder, I think, that I'm speaking to here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The way it shows up in me is what you're talking about is like when I get really anxious, and I'm a pretty anxious person by nature anyway. Everyone in my family is anxious. So, I mean, I don't know I mean, maybe I would meet criteria for generalized anxiety or something. I don't know. But in any case, one of the things that happens for me in nature that's so beautiful and healing for me is a question I ask myself often in my life has a different answer when I'm in nature. And the question is, am I okay right now? Is there anything that would suggest to me that I'm not okay right now? And when I'm in a natural environment, I look around. I mean, obviously, if I see a bear or a mountain lion, it's a different answer. But in general, there's this well-being, this wellness, and this I'm okay. I'm okay right now in this moment, and that's really powerful and healing for me to come into contact with that and then fall out of it and, ask the question again, come back into it. But nature has been a huge ally for me in that regard in my life.
Hmm. Well, as we're winding down, I'm going to tell another short story here because it just kind of came through me. Um, it's sort of a more granular look at the story I started with. So when I graduated college, this part of the story, and I won't tell the aspect that really well, which is that, I had this thing to either work on Wall Street or, to work on Wall Street. And so I was facing in myself, do I live in the concrete jungle, I was like, that's curious too, not bad. I was just like, that's really interesting. Or do I need to go, an aspect of this story you've heard many times that I haven't told much is, or do I need to go live in the forest in Vermont? And so anyways, I chose Vermont. But the story briefly I want to tell is I ended up on the highest southern peak in Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont. Like at the southern peak of this mountain, I ended up in this beautiful rustic farmhouse right at the top of the peak. And it was in a meadow that was rolling hills down the mountain. It was like a 200-acre meadow that, I would drive up this meadow at the top. And this house was actually owned by, do you remember the show Taxi Cab Confessions on, do you remember the show? It was on HBO back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, no.
Anyways, they would go in taxi cabs and like just film the person in the back, and it would be like confession. It was a funny show. This guy was the producer of that show. He built this place, and so this is a little side note. But so I got to rent this house, and I woke up every morning and would look out this field, and the sun was rising. I would always wake up for the sun, and that simple process, and I would go outside and like have my tea and sit in my chair in this, like looking out of this expanse, just mountains and 100 acres of just this huge pasture up on this mountain, and the environment, and it was like, in that moment, I'm recalling, like, I felt something else was there for me because I was so traumatized. And in this world, I actually felt nature has me, and nature is an intelligence that can heal me. There's something else here. So I just wanted to share this as we're wrapping up, that something I was fortunate to experience, was that there's natural intelligence in the world, in nature. And that intelligence actually is a healing intelligence if you can let it in. Even if we're struggling in nature or whatever, but it's there. There's a principle of healing and growth and creativity in nature that you can receive, if you want to. So I just wanted to wrap up with that story because it was an incredible time in my life of receiving the healing power of nature. And that, when I asked for it, I got like the most magical thing I could possibly imagine to do it. Right. And nature gave that to me. I didn't, nature gave that to me as like, here's your retreat center. You could stay here as long as you want. And you have the most magical retreat center you could ever imagine. Right. And we're going to make that available to you. I had no money and I figured it out, but like the world gave that to me. So I just want to offer that as we end here, that I think nature is behind us here, behind our thoughts.
And thanks for sharing that story. It feels like the story wakes up for me this memory of how we're not anything other than nature. Like our bodies are of the soil, the molecules, the atoms, the physicality of matter is of the earth. And when I feel like there's no separation between myself and the natural environment, it extends out to the universe as well. And I feel like a deep relaxation, as opposed to the way I often feel when I'm stressed, or when I forget that connection, I feel separate. There's a separateness. And it sounds like you waking up in the morning and watching the sunrise over this meadow was a deep sense of connectivity with what was actually there and what was happening.
Yeah. It was a deep connectivity, and it was receiving. I mean, the best way to say it is it was a receiving of kind of Mother Gaia, the energy of the earth.
Mm.
And just like, and I don't even think that way. Like, I don't talk that way. I don't think that way, but that's what was happening. And I felt it. I felt the earth helping me be okay, and I think that we can rely on nature in this way. Yeah. Should we start wrapping up there?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Keith.
Okay. Thanks, Will.
Yeah.